history is rarely a dinner party where everyone is invited because of their charm. More often it's a series of long, dusty walks taken by people who would really rather be home, carrying things that other people are willing to kill for. We tend to romanticize the Silk Road. We picture colorful caravans, exotic sunsets, and the elegant, delicate clinking of porcelain. But if you look past the postcard aesthetics, what you're really seeing is the world's first high-stakes logistics chain for luxury cravings. It wasn't just silk moving across those arid plains, it was the slow, methodical extraction of a lifestyle. Consider tea. In the Tang dynasty, tea was a sophisticated ritual, a meditative practice tied to the landscape of the Yangtze. By the time it reached the markets of the West, it wasn't just a beverage, it was a geopolitical currency. The demand was so ravenous that it fundamentally warped global trade. It dictated the rise and fall of merchant houses, the speed of clipper ships, and, eventually, the barrel of a gun. When we talk about the global spread of Chinese cuisine, we have to be careful with our verbs. Did the world embrace these flavors, or did the world simply develop an insatiable, colonial-grade dependency on the resources the land provided? Take spices, the star anise, the ginger, the peppercorns. These weren't just ingredients. They were the original commodities that turned the East into an object of fascination and, eventually, an object of possession. We love the narrative of cultural exchange because it sounds peaceful, like a trade fair. But exchange implies a transaction between equals. When you look at the history of the spice trade, you're looking at a map of ports that were forcibly opened, treaties signed under the shadow of blockade, and the systematic commodification of a culture's daily nourishment. We enjoy the takeout box today, the convenience of a flavor profile that has been smoothed out for a global palate. But that convenience sits on top of a very uncomfortable history. We are eating the descendants of goods that traveled along, roots built on the premise that if you possess the resource, you own the narrative. The world claims to love Chinese culture, but it might be more accurate to say the world has always loved the extraction of the East. We just prefer to call it globalization because it tastes better than the truth. The 19th century wasn't a romantic era of globetrotting for the average laborer from Guangdong. It was a pressure cooker of famine, conflict, and the brutal mechanical demands of an expanding colonial appetite. When you look at the map, you don't see migration routes, you see supply lines for human capital. Thousands were packed into the holds of steamships, bound for the goldfields of California or the railways of the Pacific Northwest, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs and a very specific, portable cultural memory, the wok. This is where the Yangzhou fried rice enters the frame, not as a culinary masterpiece of the imperial court, but as a strategic maneuver of survival. In the dense, humid labyrinths of the early Chinatowns, these immigrants were effectively boxed into social ghettos. They were barred from most trades, viewed with a toxic mix of suspicion and outright hostility by the established working class. In a land that refused to hire them, they had to invent their own employment. You see, the beauty of the fried rice isn't in its complexity, it's in its radical efficiency. It is the art of the leftover. It turns the scraps of yesterday, a bit of pork, a stray egg, a handful of scallions, the aging grains of rice that would otherwise be discarded, into a meal that is complete, hot, and affordable. It was a way to squeeze value out of nothingness. When you sit in a dimly lit stall in 1890s San Francisco, eating a bowl of this rice, you aren't just eating food, you are witnessing a defensive reaction. In a society that categorized these men as the other, the kitchen became a sovereign territory. They weren't cooking for the approval of the local culinary elite. They were cooking to keep the community fed while the world outside tried to legislate them into invisibility. Every grain of rice in that bowl is a testament to resilience. It's a quiet middle finger to the exclusionary laws and the riots that defined the era. They took the cheapest ingredients available in a hostile market and transformed them into a comfort that tasted like home, all while under the constant pressure of being told they didn't belong. The Yangzhou fried rice wasn't just a dish that traveled the world, it was a lifeboat. It fed the people who built the railroads and the cities, even as those same cities built walls to keep them out. The flavor profile is simple, but the history is heavy. It's the taste of making do when the world decides you shouldn't exist at all. You ever wonder why a man in a pinstripe suit, sitting in a velvet booth in the middle of a Midwestern suburb, feels entitled to tell a Cantonese immigrant what authentic Chinese food tastes like? Welcome to the great culinary assembly line of the West. If you've ever had a plate of General Tussauds chicken, that neon orange, deep-fried, sugar-bombed monument to convenience, you aren't eating history, you're eating a mirror. You're looking at a dish that was never served in a Hunanese kitchen, but was perfected in the boardrooms of global capital. It started back in the late 19th century. When the railways were finished and the gold mines played out, the American authorities decided they didn't need the labor they'd imported anymore. They turned the screws. The Exclusion Acts turned the Chinese community into a besieged enclave. What do you do when you're systematically barred from the real economy? You cook. You open a laundry or you open a restaurant. But you don't serve your home food. You serve the palate of the people who might burn your place down if the flavors are too challenging. Take chop suey. It's legendary, mostly because it's a lie. Some say it was invented by a desperate chef for drunk railroad workers. Others say it was a diplomatic misfire during Li Hongzhang's tour of the US in 1896. It doesn't matter. What matters is the alchemy of adaptation. To survive, the food had to be stripped of its soul. It had to be thickened with cornstarch, drowned in brown soy syrup, and rendered into something so benign, so aggressively inoffensive, that it became the perfect fuel for the industrial worker. This is the General Tso phenomenon. By the 1970s, as the West began to treat exotic culture like a commodity to be mined and refined, we took a dish that had barely existed a few decades prior and force-fed it a backstory. We turned the cuisine into an industrial export. We demanded authenticity, but what we actually wanted was the idea of China, sanitized for a palate that had been raised on blandness and efficiency. We forced the chef to become a factory worker, mass-producing nostalgia for a culture they weren't allowed to exist in fully. It's a funny kind of imperialism, really. We didn't just conquer the territory, we conquered the plate. We told them, we'll buy your food, but only if you make it taste like the childhood we never had. And so, the wok became a conveyor belt, and the culture became a footnote in a takeout menu. February 1972. The air in Beijing is thin, cold, and thick with the kind of silence that usually precedes an earthquake. Or, in this case, a tectonic shift in the geopolitical map. Richard Nixon sits at a round table, the great hall of the people, echoing with the clink of porcelain and the polite, practiced scraping of chopsticks. Watch the footage closely. It's a fascinating piece of choreography. You have the leader of the free world, or so the branding goes, awkwardly navigating a pair of lacquered sticks, attempting to pluck a piece of Peking duck with the gravity of someone handling nuclear launch codes. Opposite him, Zhou Enlai watches. There is no tremor in his hand. There is only the calm, practiced rhythm of a man who knows that food is never just sustenance. It is a medium. This is the era of panda diplomacy and the piping banquet. It's an exercise in high-stakes optics. While the world outside was still reeling from the fallout of ideological crusades and the grinding gears of the Cold War, inside these walls, the menu was the message. Every dish served was a calculated signal. The heavy, ornate courses were designed to project a civilization that had been perfecting the art of the banquet long before the current superpowers were even blips on the historical radar. It's a peculiar human instinct, isn't it? When the threat of mutual annihilation hangs over the horizon, we don't retreat into bunkers, we sit down and order a multi-course meal. We watch them toast with Mao Tai, the liquid fire that burns with the intensity of 1,000 policy disputes. And we are told this is progress. But look at the juxtaposition. Outside, the world is being carved up by lines on a map, influenced by interests that have nothing to do with the flavor of the broth or the texture of the sea cucumber. Inside, the chopsticks move in a synchronized gentle dance, a performance of civility meant to mask the fact that the people at this table are currently deciding the fate of millions who will never see the inside of a dining hall. The banquet is the ultimate velvet glove. It softens the jagged edges of imperialism, turning a standoff into a gala. By the time the dessert is cleared, the terms have shifted. The alliances have splintered, and the public is left with the sanitized image of two men, smiling, full, and seemingly content, while the machinery of statecraft continues its relentless, unbothered grind. Its culinary soft power at its most surgical. Walk into any high-end dim sum parlor in London, New York, or Paris, and you're stepping into a theater of precision. The bamboo steamer arrives, a humble circular vessel of woven wood, and when the lid is lifted, the steam clears to reveal the har-gow. The skin, translucent, pleated with mathematical exactitude, holding a precise count of shrimp. It is, by all accounts, a masterclass in structural engineering. We are told this is fine dining. We are told that the 72 distinct folds required for a perfect Xiaolong bao represent the height of human refinement. Critics write thousands of words dissecting the elasticity of the dough, the temperature of the broth, and the delicate balance of ginger and scallion. We celebrate this food as a luxury, a peak of cultural sophistication that justifies a premium price tag. But notice how the conversation shifts the moment we leave the table. There is a strange, persistent dissonance in how we treat the object versus the subject. We worship the dumpling, but we treat the hand that folded it as an invisible cog in a global machine. In the industrial-scale kitchens that feed the city, the artisan is rebranded as labor, a category we've been taught to view through a lens of cold, fiscal efficiency. We demand the delicacy, we demand the speed, and we demand the low cost, all while insulating ourselves from the reality of the person hunched over the steamer at 4 in the morning. It is a curious byproduct of our current epoch. We have become obsessed with the aesthetic of the handmade, while being profoundly hostile to the conditions required to sustain the human who makes it. We want the authenticity of the craft, yet we view the craftsperson as a replaceable component in a supply chain, someone whose value is measured strictly by their output per hour. If the dim sum is a work of art, then the kitchen is the studio. Why, then, do we insist on treating the artist like a factory worker? We curate the menu, we photograph the steam, and we hashtag the experience, all while ignoring the systemic alienation of the very people who turned a simple staple of Cantonese tea house culture into a global commodity. The steam in the bamboo basket is rising, but the person standing behind it is fading into the wallpaper of the modern economy. Perhaps, next time we sit down to admire the folds of a dumpling, we should ask ourselves why we find the geometry so beautiful, but the laborer so forgettable. By the mid-1990s, the art of the wok had been successfully hollowed out. We stopped asking for the soul of the dish and started demanding the velocity of the delivery. This is the era of the franchise, where the complex alchemy of Szechuan peppercorns and aged ferments was replaced by a standardized, high-fructose syrup glaze that tastes exactly the same in a food court in Ohio as it does in a transit hub in London. It is a fascinating bit of industrial alchemy, how to take a culinary tradition spanning 5 millennia and distill it down to a singular neon-lit plastic container. We call it convenience, but let's be honest, it's the triumph of the logistics chain over the palate. When you franchise a culture, you aren't exporting a cuisine, you're exporting a logo. The wok, once a tool of communal preparation, was sidelined for the deep fryer. Why bother with the delicate balance of wok hei, that elusive breath of the wok, when you can simply deep fry a piece of protein, toss it in a vat of corn syrup-based General Tso's sauce, and call it an authentic cross-cultural experience? This wasn't an evolution, it was an extraction. The aesthetic of the strip mall Chinese restaurant became a global architecture of efficiency. By stripping away the regionality, the distinct, biting heat of Hunan, the subtle sweetness of the Yangtze Delta, the franchise model created a universal flavor profile. It's a flavor designed by boardrooms to offend no one and satisfy only the most immediate chemical cravings for salt and sugar. We saw the rise of global chains that operated less like kitchens and more like distribution hubs. The labor was simplified, the ingredients were pre-processed in centralized facilities, and the ethnic experience was sanitized for the palate of the impatient consumer. It reflects a very specific worldview, that everything, no matter how deep its roots, must be flattened to fit into a cardboard box. If it can't be eaten with one hand while driving or staring at a screen, Does it even exist in the modern economy? We traded the conversation of the dinner table for the silence of the drive-through. We traded the wisdom of the local chef for the efficiency of the regional manager. And in that exchange, we didn't just lose the taste of the original, we lost the context of the struggle, the history, and the geography that made that food meaningful in the first place. It's all just inventory now, and the inventory is moving quite fast. The experience was sanitized for the palate of the impatient consumer. It reflects a very specific worldview, that everything, no matter how deep its roots, must be flattened to fit into a cardboard box. If it can't be eaten with one hand while driving or staring at a screen, does it even exist in the modern economy? We traded the conversation of the dinner table for the silence of the drive-through. We traded the wisdom of the local chef for the efficiency of the regional manager. And in that exchange, we didn't just lose the taste of the original, we lost the context of the struggle, the history, and the geography that made that food meaningful in the first place. It's all just inventory now, and the inventory is moving quite fast. There is a particular kind of diplomacy that doesn't require a signature on a jagged piece of parchment or a tense standoff at a naval border. It is a diplomacy that travels at the speed of a steaming bamboo basket. You might call it the soft power of the palate. When we talk about the seventh stage of Chinese culinary history, we aren't talking about the migration of recipes through ancient trade routes or the humble beginnings of the diaspora. We are talking about the strategic state-level calibration of taste as an instrument of national branding. Think about it. The Confucius Institute, by 2017, there were over 500 of these centers operating globally, ostensibly there to teach language and calligraphy. But what really anchors the cultural footprint in a foreign city? It's rarely the syntax of the language, it's the smell of the banquet. When a state decides that its cuisine is a pillar of its geopolitical narrative, it ceases to be just food. It becomes a bridge, a sedative, a way to reshape the global imagination in the face of mounting friction. It is a curious phenomenon, isn't it? As the headlines turn toward tariffs, maritime disputes, and the heavy-handed machinery of the security state, the public-facing image is smoothed over by the velvet glove of the culinary ambassador campaigns. Like the Chinese food culture overseas initiatives aren't just about sharing a love for dim sum or mapo tofu. They are about ensuring that when a citizen in London, Nairobi, or Buenos Aires thinks of a specific flag, their first association is the comfort of a meal rather than the cold calculus of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a classic maneuver practiced by empires since the dawn of time. If you can make the world crave your flavor, you have already occupied a piece of their psyche. It bypasses the intellectual defenses. You don't argue with a perfectly braised piece of red-cooked pork. You consume it. And in that moment of consumption, the complex, messy, and often brutal realities of geopolitical power become a bit harder to digest. The history of food is the history of power. And right now, the most powerful tool in the shed isn't a missile, it's the menu. It is a masterful, calculated pivot. When the world points a finger at your policy, you offer them a pair of chopsticks instead. It's hard to hold a grudge when your mouth is full, and that perhaps is the most effective diplomatic tactic of the century. We arrive, finally, at the end of the menu. The eighth stage, the point where the Silk Road turns into a digital delivery app. We call it the legacy, though if you look closely at the fine print, it's beginning to look more like a liquidation sale. For centuries, Chinese cuisine functioned as a living archive. It was a cartography of geography and necessity, the fermented bean pastes of the north, the numbing peppercorns of the Sichuan basin, the delicate, patient dim sum of the south. These weren't just recipes, they were tectonic plates of culture, shifted and settled over dynasties. But today, we are witnessing the great flattening. We are in the era of the fusion, a word that sounds sophisticated until you realize it's usually just a polite shorthand for how much can we strip away before the customer stops recognizing the shape of the bowl. In the modern corporate kitchen, tradition is treated like a legacy software update, something to be patched, trimmed, and eventually discarded to ensure the product runs faster on a global operating system. We see the deconstructed dumpling, the accessible stir-fry, the MSG-free marketing campaigns that treat the history of flavor as a health hazard to be mitigated. It is the culinary equivalent of turning a grand, sprawling, epic poem into a 15-second social media soundbite. Why does this matter? Because when you sanitize a culture's palate to meet the lowest common denominator of a global market, you aren't sharing it. You're colonizing it, piece by piece, stripping the context until all that remains is a generic, profitable husk. It's the triumph of the balance sheet over the banquet. We are trading the nuance of centuries for the convenience of the quarterly projection. There is a profound irony in how we celebrate the globalization of these dishes. We applaud the ubiquity, the availability, the sheer reach of the menu. But as the borders of the plate expand, the depth of the flavor often recedes. When everything is fused, nothing is distinct. And when nothing is distinct, the culture that birthed these techniques becomes merely a brand aesthetic, a vintage font on a neon sign, a background texture for a lifestyle brand. So, what is the legacy? Is it the preservation of the craft, or is it the survival of the concept in a sterilized, profitable form? As we scroll through the endless menus of the future, perhaps we should ask ourselves not what we're eating, but what we've forgotten to taste.